Jhaymee, thank you so much for joining me. I am so excited to be here with you doing this
Yes.
and wanted to start by introducing you. So for those of you who don't know Jhaymee, Jhaymee Tynan is an enterprise AVP in integration for Atrium. And she is also the founder of 100 by 2030, which is a career initiative committed to sponsoring 100 women of color by 2030. And in addition to both of those wonderful things, Jhaymee also hosts a video series called Amplify Your Career, where she speaks about how women of color can amplify their careers through sponsorship. So, Jhaymee, why don't you add anything that I missed and talk a little bit more about 100 by 2030?
Yeah, well, I think you did a fabulous introduction. So thank you for that. And the only thing I would add to that, a lot of people, when they hear about my initiative, they really want to understand the catalyst behind why I started 100 by 2030. So I'll touch on that a little bit. When I think back to the times that I've been sponsored in my career, um, every time has been transformational for me. How I ended up in this role as enterprise AVP was through sponsorship. I had some very senior folks at Atrium Health that believed in my potential, wanted to give me stretch assignments, wanted to give me exposure and visibility across our organization. And through that, I was able to demonstrate my ability to operate at an executive level and therefore led to some opportunities and ultimately a promotion, which was fantastic. So when I think about other women, women in general, but specifically women of color, and I think about their career goals and aspirations and how they plan to get there, I want to make sure everyone understands that sponsorship should absolutely be part of your plan. Finding sponsors, nurturing those relationships, and most importantly, really leveraging those relationships to get the visibility and exposure that you need to advance to the next level.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you. And you started this initiative 100 by 2030 this year, correct?
I did. Yes,
In February, I think.
I did. Pre-COVID almost.
Oh, yes, you're right there. So can you tell me what you've accomplished so far just in less than a year doing this?
Yeah, well, I it actually started the catalyst between this year was an article that I wrote for Forbes, which it was titled "Why I'm Sponsoring 100 Women of Color in Healthcare," and that got a lot of traction. It got a lot of attention from people who either have been sponsored, who have served as sponsors in their past and present, or even individuals who had never even heard of what sponsorship is and said to themselves, "I want to learn more about this." So I launched it in February of this year. And since then, I've been able to sponsor roughly 31 to 32 women by nominating them for public speaking engagements, nominating them for board seats, and then also really trying to extend my networks to them through warm introductions, etc. And it's been a really heartwarming experience. I love being able to give back. And most importantly, I love being able to see women thriving because they are being sponsored. So I've gotten some exposure, obviously, but I've been able to really accelerate my goal, which was 100 women by in 10 years. And in year one, I've hit 30+% of my goal. So that's been really exciting. And I'm getting interest from individuals who want to participate and sponsor women themselves, as well as organizations who said, we want to be at the forefront of helping to increase representation within our organization. And we feel that sponsorship is a great way to do that. So I've had some interest in organizations and companies wanting to make their own commitments to sponsorship.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think for me, when I first saw this initiative, I had the question that a lot of people have, which is what is sponsorship? You touched on it a little bit, but in particular, what's the difference between a sponsor and a mentor? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a very common question, and I don't ever get tired of answering it because I think it's an important distinction.
Mhm.
So when you think about a mentor, most people are familiar with mentorship because it's very mainstream, is what I call it. It's always talked about as a way to grow yourself and develop yourself. So, a mentor is someone that you go to for advice. If I'm in a new role and I need to talk to someone to understand kind of the political landscape in which I work, or maybe I need advice on who I should start networking with to get exposure. Or perhaps I'm navigating a difficult situation at work and I just want some coaching on how to approach resolving that. I go to my mentor. And that mentor is a safe place to go to when you want to talk about sensitive topics around your career and career development. And they're there to kind of give you advice based on their own experience, what they've seen. A sponsor is actually someone very different. They are very much your advocate. They're the person that when they are talking to their peers, and they tend to be very senior level, they don't have to be, but when they're talking with their peers and new opportunities are arising, whether it's a new role that the organization is supporting or creating, or maybe it's a very high visibility project that they're looking for rising talent to be participating in or leading, that sponsor is in the room and saying, you know what, Jocelyn's the right person. I've worked with her. I think that she's fantastic. They are amplifying you by putting your name in the hat for these opportunities. And because of their power and their influence, they're able to get their peers to listen. Because I'm sure in every organization, everyone's clawing at that next opportunity. But the ones that get listened to, the ones that have a followership, and the ones that are really amplifying other women and women of color and saying, I think this person deserves that promotion, or I think this person deserves that high visibility project, they are there to advocate for your advancement and your growth. So they don't typically serve as a coach or an advisor. They are there to say, you know what, there's this national award and I think that you'd be perfect for it because you've done a really great job, and they nominate you for it. And so it's more action oriented, it's more about advocacy and helping you to advance.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you. And what would you say, maybe one or two tips for someone who's like, oh, I want a mentor, I want a sponsor? What can they do? Because you can't just, I mean, maybe you can just reach out and ask someone, but I think, right, that's a difficult relationship to cultivate. So, what advice would you give someone?
Yeah, I would say there's generally, in my experience, two different time frames or timelines when it comes to developing relationships with mentors and sponsors. I would say for mentors, those relationships, while they take a little time to develop, tend to happen quicker than sponsor relationships. Um, I've been in formal and informal mentoring programs where I've been matched with a mentor. And of course, we deepen our relationship over time, but that matching happens very quickly. With sponsorship, you really want that person to understand you as an individual and what your unique skills, knowledge, and abilities are. And it's taken me a few years to really develop relationships with sponsors to where they feel comfortable advocating for me, because it is a risky proposition for someone to put their name on the line for you. So I would say if you want a mentor, number one, I think most people who you would approach to be a mentor would be very flattered and excited to serve as a mentor for you. I think the higher up you go, it becomes more of a challenge when it comes to just their availability and time to dedicate to the mentoring relationship. So I think with mentorship, you absolutely can make a direct ask and say, hey, I've really admired you. I would love it if you would serve as my mentor. The only caution I would give is to make sure that you think about what you want that mentorship relationship to be. Is it a monthly connection? Is it ad hoc, where it's whenever you have a question about something that's happening in your career, you just want to be able to have someone to reach out to? So be very intentional about what that relationship looks like. I would also say for sponsorship, that relationship and that ask is a little bit different. I don't ever recommend that people flat out and directly ask, will you be my sponsor? Because that's a little bit of a weird and awkward ask. Typically, I tell people you ask for a sponsorship action. So, again, if you want to sit on a community board and you have a sponsor or potential sponsor who could really help you get that board seat, it's more about, hey, would you recommend me or nominate me for that board seat? or that project or that speaking engagement. And then naturally, that relationship continues to grow and develop where they become more of a sponsor for you. So it's more about making the ask for the action of sponsorship versus saying, will you be my sponsor? Um, and I think that also makes it less awkward and more welcoming for the sponsor to support you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Um, so this next question, I want to dive a little bit deeper into something I saw you talk about in one of your Amplify Your Career videos. So one of the things you mentioned is that you aren't really a fan of the phrase fake it till you make it. And that competence is rooted in confidence. And I like that. But one of the things that came up when I heard you talking about it is that so often I've seen men in their careers that have all this confidence when maybe they shouldn't, they aren't competent. And so when you're speaking to women, and in particular women of color, how do you think about that when they might be going up against people who are not even necessarily faking it till they make it, but just think they can do anything?
Yeah.
And what would you say to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, so I love that you watched that segment because I remember when I was coming up in my career, that was the number one piece of advice I was given. Fake
Mm,
it till you make it, right?
yeah.
And I think the foundation of that is that you don't need to have everything ticked and tied. Don't need to be able to check every box to be able to have an opinion, have a position, be able to speak up and advocate for yourself and your skills. But I think sometimes people err too far to the right with it. So they're faking it too much, right? So that they're not developing their own craft, they're not developing their own knowledge base. And so when I say competence breeds confidence, a lot of times what I find is women are afraid or they feel as if someone is very vocal and loud or animated in a meeting, that automatically means that they're knowledgeable. And I don't think that's the case. I think you have to be very confident in what you know and also be confident in what you don't know. And I think it's absolutely okay to acknowledge the fact that I might not know X, but I will find the answer, right? And I think most people don't expect everyone to have all the answers. In fact, if I am speaking to someone who comes across as a know-it-all or says they have all the answers, I'm more skeptical of that person than I am of the person that says, you know what, I don't know that very well. I'm going to find the answers and get back to you. So I think as women, we have to be rooted in our competence, what we know. We also need to understand what we don't know and try to fill those gaps. But absolutely, when you're in a meeting or you're talking with a teammate or you're doing a big presentation, I think when you are confident to know what you don't know and you're okay living in that awkwardness and that space of, I have a knowledge gap and I need to close it, I think it bodes well than someone who is just very overly confident and comes across as someone that knows everything. I think most people are very skeptical of that type of person.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Um, so you talked about that you've sponsored 31 or 32 women of color so far this year. And from your website, I saw that that's 46 different sponsorship actions.
Yeah.
So it's really amazing. Can you talk about one or two stories that you're particularly proud of that can give people, maybe just a better idea of exactly what actions you're taking and how those are playing out?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. Number one, I have several mentees that I support, both as in a mentoring relationship, but also in a sponsorship capacity. So there was one woman in my network who had always wanted to be on a national board. She really wanted to be able to give back, starting on a nonprofit board and obviously evolving to maybe a for-profit board in her career. And she noticed that I was on the board of Women in Healthcare and wanted to talk to me about my experience. And we had an open nomination process recently where she wanted me to nominate her for that opportunity. And I said, absolutely. I think that she'd be fantastic for the board. And I think she found out last week that she was selected for the board, right? So again, using your networks and your influence to nominate someone and say, hey, I think she would be a really good addition to the board and giving that person the opportunity. So that's one example. The other example is I had a mentee of mine who had believed that she was not being recognized and rewarded for the work and the knowledge that she has, and felt that she was at a level in her career that really wasn't, appropriate for her and what she brings to the table. So she was the type of person that was a bit shy in advocating for herself, or applying for certain jobs. And we had worked over a period of about 6 months where I was, again, using my power and influence to nominate her for opportunities. And she went from what one would consider like a senior associate level to a director level at one of the largest healthcare systems in the country in a matter of 6 months. And what was fantastic about that opportunity is that there was a report last year from McKinsey and Lean In called Women in the Workplace. They talked about this issue of the broken rung, where the getting to that first manager level role is really where there is a huge discrepancy in inequity for women. And so she was able to go from what I would consider an individual contributor role to a national manager, people management level role in a matter of 6 months, just through sponsorship and advocacy, right? So those would be two examples that I would offer as far as things that you can do as a sponsor, but also the outcomes as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then you particularly focus on healthcare, but with your initiative 100 by 2030, it's inspired people in other industries to sponsor women of color. So if someone wants to get involved in this initiative, what are some of the ways they can do that?
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. So there's really two avenues for you if you want to get involved. If you're an individual person who says, I would love to make this commitment for myself and sponsor women of color, you can absolutely do so. And I would love to connect with you. I have a website, jhammeetynan.com, and you can reach out to me there and make your commitment of sponsorship. So I always say no commitment is too big or too small. So perhaps you want to start with sponsoring 5 women in 10 years, or maybe you want to make a splurge and do even more than 100, but you want to make that commitment. What I would do is we would connect on a quarterly basis. I would check in with you to see how many women you've sponsored and what was the outcome. And then we're going to track that over time so that we can be able to tell these, what I call stories of sponsorship, about how sponsorship is really making an impact in the lives and careers of women of color. If you're an organization that wants to get involved, and perhaps you're listening to this or reading this blog post and say, you know what, I think our organization is ready to make a public commitment of sponsorship of women of color, you would actually do the same thing. You would reach out to me on my website. We would talk about what that commitment's going to look like. I think most organizations, this is my bias, could probably do way more than 100 women in the next 10 years. So we would talk about what that commitment looks like. And then we would, again, track your progress. I would check in with you on those stories, because ultimately what we want to do across both individuals and organizations is impact 10,000 plus women of color across the globe. So, and I can't do it alone, right? So I'm only one person. So I would love others to join me and make their commitments and follow through and hold themselves accountable. So if you're an individual organization, reach out to me on my website and we'll get started.
Awesome. And then just to dive into that a little more, how could an employer create an initiative? So, you're talking about them making commitments, but is there anything, like you think about employers creating mentorship programs, is there anything like that, like a sponsorship program that an employer can help facilitate? What would
Absolutely. In fact, I think many organizations have realized that mentorship programs serve a very important purpose, to engage employees in their career development and give them a sense of ownership of their careers, right? Because you as a mentee are really serving up what you want to learn, and you're working with a mentor to help you close those sort of career development gaps. I see a lot of organizations that are now moving towards more targeted sponsorship programs. And so as part of this work, I think it's important for organizations to understand what their overarching goal is when it comes to DE&I, right? So what do you ultimately want to achieve? Is it more women of color or people of color in leadership positions? Is it more people of color in people management positions? I think you need to be very solid on what your end game or your end goal is. And sponsorship programs are nothing new. Many organizations have employed them. I think there are a couple things I would offer if you're thinking about starting a sponsorship program. I think the most successful sponsorship programs start by having sponsors who want to participate. They can't feel that this is being forced upon them. They can't feel that this is a chore. They really have to be really excellent sponsors. And one of my LinkedIn videos, I talk about the 5 C's of a great sponsor, right? So you need to have sponsors who really embody those 5 C's, which is being courageous, being connected, being candid, having capital. And of course, I'm blanking on the 5th C right now, but really the 5 C's of sponsorship, you want your sponsors to have those traits. And committed is the other 5 C. There we go.
Awesome.
So courageous, committed, connected, candid, and capital. So you really want to start with a good foundation of sponsors who want to participate. I think the other thing is you have to be very realistic about your goals. So if you're thinking that you're going to be able to promote every single woman that participates in a sponsorship program, you might want to temper and recalibrate that a bit. Perhaps you have the infrastructure to do that, or you need to work towards that. But you need to be very clear and be very clear with the proteges in the program what their expectations should be when they finish. So those are the 2 things I would offer. If you're thinking about starting a sponsorship program, get great sponsors, set expectations correctly with mentees. And the third one I would say is actually metrics. Make sure you're tracking the participation, what that looks like, what did the sponsors do, and holding them accountable for the results.
For sure. Yeah, and then another thing I think about and wonder about is like smaller companies. So if you're a company that has, let's say, 50 employees, is this something you think a company of that size can do? Is that possible?
Absolutely. I think sponsorship should be embedded in your culture,
Mhm.
and how people see themselves and see the support and commitment of the organization to helping them grow. So, regardless of the size of your organization, there are many things you can do from a sponsorship perspective internally and also externally, right? So, we talked about internally, obviously, it's very focused on advancement and promotions for a lot of people. But outside of an organization, it's focused on getting people visibility, right? So giving opportunities for people to speak at national conferences, representing your organization very positively, but also giving them a platform, I think is another sponsorship action that organizations can and should take. So it's both internal and external, and doesn't matter what size organization you have.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me today. It's really awesome. Is there anything you want to add that I didn't ask about?
Probably the only thing I would add, and it's one of my slogans that I very much feel passionate about, because I feel like for women of color, a lot of times when you see organizations talk about issues of advancement within their organization, they always talk about this issue of the pipeline, right? We don't have a pipeline of women, or even more so, we don't have a pipeline of women of color who are ready for that next step. And I would like to challenge organizations to think and take more ownership of that pipeline and turn it on its head. Because I think a lot of times when you get to a certain level in your career, you forget about the fact that you were sponsored to get where you got. And I believe it is a sponsorship issue where executives need to feel that it's a fundamental responsibility for them to sponsor others, and not do it because the organization is saying it's the right thing to do, doing it because that's how you got advanced in your career, and you want to pay it back and you want to pay it forward. So I always say it's not a pipeline issue, it's a sponsorship issue, because I think the responsibility and accountability for advancement and increasing representation. Obviously, your organization has a role to play, but I think you as an individual leader and executive can do a lot more through sponsorship.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I attended an HBR webinar a couple weeks ago about inclusion and how these women spoke about starting with inclusion in an organization to attract diversity versus the other way around. Like, let's get diverse people here and then they'll feel included.
Mhm.
And one of the women said that they do work with specific companies where they go and they look at the representation that they're missing in the company, and they'll always hear that it's a
Yeah.
pipeline issue. And they said they have not had a single situation where they couldn't find the people that were missing.
Yeah.
They said they just went out into the community and spoke to those people to figure out how to get them to apply for those jobs, or to, to be
Mhm.
those candidates, where to find them. And yeah, they said there wasn't a single time that it's ever happened, and they don't think it will ever happen. So I thought that was really interesting, because you hear people say that, but you don't always have like the numbers or data to back, you can say, well, it's not a pipeline issue, but then you have to dig and find people. But these women were like, we've done that, and it's just not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I always think about, you know, you draw on experiences from when you're younger. And I remember my sister, my niece is like the worst in losing things. And my sister would always tell, you need to go look for it, right? And she says, oh, I've looked everywhere and I haven't found anything. And my sister would always say, you need to be looking in the right places. And that's absolutely true when it comes to wanting to increase representation in leadership. Of course, if you don't put the right effort and energy into looking, you're not going to find what you're looking for.
yeah,
If you don't understand what you need, you're not going to be able to find it. But if you look in the right places and you hold the right people accountable, you absolutely can change the trajectory of your organization when it comes to DE&I. So I always say, you need to be looking in the right places. And if you come up with no candidates, then that means you weren't looking in the right places and you need to continue.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add before we go?
No, I think this is great. Thank you for the opportunity.